Thanks. Good.
Can anyone hear me?
Not yet. So, all right, thanks for your patience, everyone.
Congratulations to you and Paul.
Thank you, Joe.
And an amazing turnout.
Thank you. It is a great turnout, and I'm really just thrilled to be back because the museum helped us with the first book. Those of you who don't know, this is the sequel, so you have to read them in sequence. So you can buy the book now, but you have to go back and buy The Age of Cryptocurrency as well. We are in total all sales mode at this time of the publishing cycle. So The Age of Cryptocurrency was out 3 years ago. This is the sequel to that, and the Museum of American Finance sponsored that as well. We had it down at the lovely offices, and indeed Larry Summers was on stage. So I'm thrilled when I ran into Mindy and we had another chat about doing this all over again, so thanks very much for putting it together. I also want to use this opportunity very quickly to, since this is our launch, to thank people who have made not just this event, but this bigger project really, the book, possible. My editor over 2 books now, Tim Bartlett over there, Leo Johansson, thank you very much for your support and publicity as well. Of course, my co-author Joe, my agent Gillian McKenzie, my wife Alicia Carmona, without whom any of this would be possible, and a whole host of other folks who've contributed in various ways to this. Thank you very, very much. It's been a long but enjoyable ride. It always is. Anyway, it is a big, ambitious title, Gerald. You're absolutely right. So I'm actually thrilled that I have Joe on stage with me, because vicariously I'm going to allow Joe to get in, not so much get in my head, but explain why this is such a big deal. I believe it. I believe this technology is absolutely groundbreaking, and I think it has it's going to have a very big impact on the world. But somebody who I think has probably saw that before many of us is Joe Lubin. And so I think maybe we could just start off, if you don't mind, because it's a good way to entree into this. When you started going down the rabbit hole, what was that moment, and why was it so important? What is the big deal about blockchain technology? Go back
to my heart at the time.
Speak from the heart, but not exactly with the heart.
So very briefly, I've been a technologist for some decades and transitioned into the world of finance for a little while, and began to pay attention to economic systems, financial systems, political systems, and felt that there was some moral and financial bankruptcy in the world, where there had been decades of erosion in trust. And so there were people occupying everything, and I felt that was potentially a little bit futile. And I was a little bit depressed about how things were going to advance. I felt like we were in a slow cascading collapse, and I didn't see good ways for us to grow our way out of that slow cascading collapse. The alternative was a nonlinear fast collapse, and so neither of those alternatives were very exciting to me. But when I read the white paper by Satoshi, the Bitcoin white paper, I felt like this was the invention of a technology. It was actually the invention of 3 technologies, but it was an invention that could enable us to not worry about occupying everything. I think it was valuable for people to walk down the streets with signs and proclaim that there is a problem here. But we could really just get busy and build better systems on better foundations. So I read the white paper describing Bitcoin. It was a very immature space at that point, and I didn't want to go out and start a business in this immature space, but I did become expert on the technology. A couple years later, lots of different people in the space realized that the first invention, the Bitcoin, which existed on the second invention, the blockchain, shouldn't be the only application on blockchain technology. Blockchain is this new trusted infrastructure, and we should create systems that make it feasible or easy for software developers to build any sort of application on this new breakthrough kind of database system. So when I read a white paper written by Vitalik Buterin describing the Ethereum platform, where he envisioned a very clean separation between the protocol level and the application layer, which would enable the protocol priests who previously in other platforms had been the only people active in the space. And so if you rely on protocol priests to build every new application, that's going to take a long time. Vitalik's vision was scalable in a human sense, in that the protocol priests of the Ethereum platform can labor and continually improve the protocol level, but we built a clean application layer that any of millions of software developers around the world could recognize the tools for, identify their own problems, and build their own solutions. And so that sort of scalable ability to build alternative, better systems built on better foundations was what got me fully engaged.
So I met Vitalik conference in, when was it, 2013, I think, when Ethereum was first being more or less soft launched at that time. I think you may have been there, I don't know.
January 2014.
Right, and so he was talking about it first at that conference in 2013. And he said to me at the time, he said, we want to build the sort of Android platform for decentralized applications. And I thought that was a really interesting way to conceive of this. So decentralized applications are, they could be an app. They could call them dApps, actually, decentralized app. So you can think of it as this application layer, this service that you can do things with. The big difference being that rather than it being run by Uber as the centralized party that's looking after it, nobody controls it. It's a decentralized system. This is a very powerful idea, right? So this gets to Joe's point about you can either protest the breakdown of our system in 2008, or you can build an entirely different one that has a decentralized model behind it. So, Ethereum became this thing. So you actually answered the second question I was going to ask you, to sort of give us a bit of a difference, a bit of a comparison between Ethereum and Bitcoin. But maybe just talk a little bit then about consensus. So you helped found it with Vitalik, that is the Ethereum Foundation, and then you moved on and set up this own development lab, which has just grown exponentially. Tell us a little bit about what that journey's been all about, and what is consensus? What is it? What does it do?
Sure. So let me expand a little bit first. So it's not that nobody controls these decentralized applications. You can create it. You can create structures like that, but I think importantly, it is a way of distributing control a lot amongst a bunch of different actors. It's a way of enabling content creators or resource providers to more directly access consumers with far fewer intermediaries, or with the right sizing of the value that intermediaries extract in mediating, adding value to those kinds of transactions. So 1 year into the Ethereum project, and it wasn't just me and Vitalik. I was one of 8 founders on the project, and many other people who worked to bring it forth. 1 year into the project, it looked like we were getting very close to releasing version 1 of the platform. And there weren't a huge number of these developers that I was describing working at the application layer. And so I started speaking with different people who were interested in building things at the application layer of Ethereum. I gathered some people into a small company called Consensus, and we were essentially attempting to be a venture production studio. So we'd built some MVPs, we'd wrap them in companies, and the idea was that we would scale by bringing external investment into these different projects. What happened was it was hard building decentralized applications with no real developer tools or other infrastructure. So we built an app store, we built an accounting tool, a handful of other little things. But the people who were building those things began getting busy trying to build their own tools. So the individual who built the app store ended up building something called Truffle, which is now Truffle Suite, which has seen over 300,000 downloads and essentially enabled the Ethereum application developer community to be 30 times larger, according to Gartner, than any other blockchain application layer development community. We built infrastructure. Early on, you had to download the client to your laptop in order to develop. Also, your customers of your application would have to download the Ethereum client to their laptop and sync it, and that was just really a non-starter for any sort of reasonable application. So we had, built something called MetaMask, which enabled anybody to release their application in the form of a URL in a browser. As things started to get busier, we needed things like load balancing solutions and other sorts of things. Transactions were dropping to the ground, and so we formed a team called Infura, which is now has built infrastructure that enables us to process around 6 billion requests per day from the public Ethereum ecosystem. We've peaked out at 9 billion on a few days. So that's how things got started. We have continued to grow. We've built what we consider core components at the application layer. So those are things like the Uport self-sovereign identity system, built reputation systems, bounty systems to incentivize people to build stuff that you'd like to see built, an accounting platform, decentralized governance tools. And we and others are using those kinds of solutions in building more complex applications. So those complex applications usually take the form of protocol-based open platforms. So instead of a company offering services to a consumer in what is sometimes an adversarial relationship, these open platforms can have lots of different actors in different roles on the platform. None of those actors are overly controlling or overly monetizing the way, say, a Facebook would be, and they can merge a set of services, again, with right-sized intermediation. So again, connecting resources to consumers or content to consumers. We're doing that in supply chain, in the music industry, in software support, and a variety of other niches.
What most excites you in terms of, sort of stepping away a little bit from the sort of technologist side and what you see as the sort of the coolest tech? Where do you see the most interesting and exciting idea that grapples with this problem you alluded to at the beginning? This let's not occupy, let's build. What's the biggest idea that's coming out of Consensus or anywhere else in the Ethereum ecosystem?
So we view what we're doing as ecosystem building. So there are many extremely important components. Probably the foundational component is self-sovereign identity. In our opinion, the internet is a miraculous invention that has brought us tremendously far. It's really transformed society, but it's broken. It's really profoundly broken in a lot of different ways. And it's broken because identity is broken. In the developed world, we spray aspects of our identity throughout the internet. It gets stored on corporate servers. It gets monetized by corporations. And we're essentially exploited. Facebook and LinkedIn and many other pretty excellent utilities provide us with some value, but there's still something quite broken in how those systems are constructed. So we built something called Uport, which is a blockchain-based self-sovereign identity system. It enables you to establish your own blockchain-based identity. You fully control it. Enables you to upload encrypted aspects of your identity that are selectively and granularly disclosable in situations you designate. So in those protocol-based open platforms, you can be interacting with other actors from your own thoroughly owned identity. You can potentially upload more valuable information than something that you'd be comfortable sharing with Facebook or LinkedIn. And it'll be stored in essentially a personal data locker. So if we fix identity on the blockchain, if we enable it to be linked into legacy identity providers like governments and banks via cryptographic attestations, and that all currently works right now. Our identity system is being used in Zug currently in Switzerland to enable citizens to access government services and soon to participate in plebiscites. So if we do start to fix that, this identity can be used as single sign-on in many different situations. That will enable us to move towards a better kind of internet. It also has exciting ramifications for the developing world, where people don't have persistent portable identity and reputation, and they don't have financial relationships. And this same identity system, if you have access to a smartphone, you can establish your own blockchain-based identity. You can have your community do the same. You can use your social context to lodge these same kinds of attestations and develop reputation. You could then potentially reach across the world and get a microloan and bootstrap a business. So potentially profound.
It is. I mean, as another little plug here, there is a whole chapter in the book about identity. And I remember when we wrote it, and Tim was doing his usual heavy edit. He goes, "Wow, this is maybe the biggest chapter of the lot," because it is such a big deal. It's also one of the most difficult things to tackle, right? Because there's so much politics. I remember Stephen Sprague saying to me, I don't know if you know him, but he said, "Look, identity has always been weaponized, right? So we have to be very, very careful what we do with it. So it is a challenging field, but it's got so much potential to just, as you point out, to sort of change the structure of the internet, but also maybe liberate people who have not had access to this critical component of who we say we are." So, I mean, let's shift gears a little bit. Everybody has been talking for some time about the ICO boom. We've had all these tokens that became sort of quite distinctly associated with Ethereum and with consensus as well, with the ERC20 standard that was used to introduce them. You know, some wild stuff, talk of a lot of scams, the SEC getting involved. Are we in a bubble? What do you make of that very crazy moment that we went through last year? Because you guys wrote it. It was a big deal for a consensus in many ways.
Sure. So I do playfully say, yes, it's definitely a bubble. And it's one of a series of bubbles. If you consider 10, 20, 30 years of higher highs and higher lows to be a series of bubbles, then I'm pretty comfortable calling it a bubble. So if we look back, we discussed this before, if we look back at the dot-com era, that was a bubble, that was a bust. Most companies died during that era, or towards the end of that era. Some companies survived. Every one of those companies had investment, which drove some learning, drove some pivoting in business models. All those people ended up in successful companies. They started new companies. So it drove a tremendous amount of creation. It drove a tremendous amount of creative destruction. And obviously, it's profoundly affected global society. So I think that was a very successful bubble. We've seen a bunch of bubbles in our space already. They pop for 5 minutes, and then everybody who understands the profound implications of this technology surges back in. And the fear-greed cycle is going to cause prices to overshoot and then correct. So not worried about that at all. We do have a ton of good projects in the space, remarkable talent in the space, a lot of bad projects in the space, and a lot of fraudulent projects in the space. For probably thousands of years, certain kinds of actors have been taking advantage of naive consumers based on information asymmetries. And so that is exacerbated in our space because the context is global and the barrier to entry to running these schemes is very low. In contrast to how the current financial world works, where you can perpetrate one of these schemes, you can create some shares, good project or bad project or fraudulent project, you can set up a bucket shop and sell via the phone to grannies. That sort of situation is harder to ferret out. It's harder to police. With token launches, we can take advantage of that global context. We can take advantage of the low barrier to access that information. We can essentially peer pressure all these projects into disclosing all the appropriate elements of information and store those things in an Edgar-like database so we can expose it all. And we can incentivize analysts around the world via different mechanisms. We have one project that's moving in that direction to share their analyses and hopefully have a logically centralized place where people, consumers can go to access useful data. So I think we'll be able to self-regulate. I think we'll be able to effectively protect consumers better. Regulators around the world, we speak to many, especially securities regulators, are excited about the technology. They're also scared of the technology, mostly because it's not well self-regulated yet. And so they're, in certain places, they're certainly trying to chill some of the improper exuberance. We're also very encouraged by the fact that there are certain jurisdictions, including in this country, where the regulators are really starting to understand the incredible power of tokenizing a security, tokenizing a share, making it a programmable object, enabling fractional ownership of certain things like real estate perhaps, but also enabling the issuance of utility tokens to consumers for membership, for consumer access to something, for access to scarce resources, and understanding that those things should not be considered a security.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting moment because, it is an unregulated space and we haven't yet built those self-regulatory tools that you're referring to. And that's what's exciting about it. In fact, that we made
it is regulated. It's definitely regulated.
It's regulated, but it is a space that is operating with a lack of understanding, I suppose, is the biggest challenge in this, right? So there is a capacity to scam people that sort of is emerging within that space. But it's interesting to see once we get to that point where we can have a much more secure model and maybe get away from the hype and the bubble. These ideas you're referring to, utility tokens and tokenizing physical assets and so forth. What's the driving purpose of it all? What is if we can tokenize things within a community, and now there is, to me it seems like a new form of money, right? We have mediums of exchange that actually have governance built into them. And we can establish what we say in the book about this as effectively a way to sort of start tackling the tragedy of the commons, because you build incentives into the governance structure and the money itself starts to govern things. Is that part of where you think it's all going, or was it more just a sort of a way to raise money through alternative means?
It is that, but it's greater liquidity, it's reduced friction, it's greater liquidity for certain sorts of things. So if you tokenize real estate, instead of getting a loan, potentially you can sell a piece of a property. More profoundly, it is the movement of all the foundational elements of our society into native digital form. So away from analog form, away from frictional, delay-filled forms rendered on pieces of paper with ink using rubber stamps and involving subjective interpretation of rules and ultimately things like force and incarceration. So if all these elements, foundational elements like money and identity and reputation and legally enforceable agreements and certificates, like education and government certificates, if they all move into native digital format in registries on blockchains, whether they're national blockchains or public permissionless blockchains, we can see any transaction involving those things be cleared and settled instantly, in the instant of the transaction, rather than having that extend over days or weeks or more in some cases. And so if all these transactions are clearing and settling with very few delays, very small delays, we can stack all those value creation events more closely in time. And as with the power of compounding interest, we can compound value creation at a much quicker exponential.
So I think we're almost running out of time, but I just want to pivot a little bit here again as well, and note the fact that within this very big swirling Ethereum ecosystem, in addition to this permissionless architecture, which is the underlying Ethereum blockchain is built, where we have an open public system, there is the capacity to build these closed private blockchain structures using the same Ethereum code and the like. How do you see all that playing out? Because in some respects it's seen as certainly we looked at what the banks were doing with R3 and so forth, that there was an attempt to co-opt the system, build walled gardens, gated communities that only they play in, and it was seen as a bit of a way to challenge the very open model that Bitcoin represented. Ethereum seems to be sort of operating in both those worlds. What does that mean for you in terms of the future? How do the permissioned and permissionless blockchains kind of come together in the future, and is there a conflict there?
Yeah, so we at Consensus do consulting work for companies, for consortia, for governments, and nearly all of that is on private permissioned versions of Ethereum. And so a couple elements to discuss. The first is that just as with the internet and the World Wide Web, it took 10 years for it to really ramify for consumers, for security reasons, for privacy reasons. And we're seeing the same sort of dynamic, really, where corporations are liking this technology very much, and they want to use it, but they're not quite comfortable. And also, Ethereum isn't really ready with respect to privacy, confidentiality, and scalability. And so it makes a ton of sense to start building systems in a more controlled context, in a private permission context, perhaps in a public permission context where you have disclosed identity. And so we're seeing that. We're going to see a bunch of those systems move to public blockchain as it gets appropriately scalable over time. And we're building some systems that are intended initially to start private and permissioned, but move to the public blockchain. Scalability is also a really good reason why we expect this sort of pattern to persist even for certain applications or beyond certain applications that can move to public blockchain. So there are many mechanisms to achieve essentially infinite scalability for Ethereum. So that's infinite transactions per second. Some of those include esoteric sounding things like state channels and plasma networks, side chains.
It's not ready now, right? Because the CryptoKitties fad sort of caused all this congestion. I think it's just an important point to sort of close up on, because we are not yet there, right? And where is all this development going to come from?
Yeah, so CryptoKitties was a great situation, which pointed out a few of the points that we need to clean up. So scalability has been an issue since information technology was invented. Software developers are always pushing the limits, and we need applications like CryptoKitties to point out where we can fix our clients, and we've already done that in response to that, and how we can architect our systems better. So scalability will appear in a very significant way, an order of magnitude or two over the next 2 years. And then with mechanisms like proof of stake and sharding will enable us to scale so that as you move new shards of compute infrastructure to the Ethereum network, you are roughly linearly increasing throughput, and you can just keep adding machines for as long as the world needs.
The point being that this is not a static technology. So when you're told, oh, look, it's never going to be able to process as much data as we need to run the world, you've got to think about how fast things are changing amongst this very large, big community of impassioned developers. So Joe, thank you very much.